session about our work to develop an international data space for open access book usage data exchange across both public and private stakeholders. With that, we're going to each kind of introduce a bit about ourselves as we begin. And my job here is to hand things over to Laura Ricci of Clarke and Esposito. So Laura is our first.
Hi, thank you, Christina. So I'm going to take a minute and pull out my notes because I have a lot to say and I'll absolutely forget. Oop. Already messed things up. How do I fix this? Well, while I fix this, so I'm a senior consultant at Clarke and Esposito. We are a firm that works with a lot of different scholarly stakeholders, a lot of societies, a lot of independent publishers, a lot of libraries, looking at lots of common problems. I'm going to be talking today about as I get organized, a study that we did back in 2021 that looked at the supply chain for open access books. Why this is important is because the supply chain is a way to describe the stakeholders involved in open access books, talk about the kinds of information that they share with each other. And if you know about the information that they share, you know things like what business terms and licenses are important to communicate, what metadata elements are important, and also things like performance indicators and metrics of success, and how people talk about things like how publishers and funders of open access books know which books are successful, which models are successful. And if you can trace the information flow about all of these things, then you can also see where there are communication breakdowns and where there's not enough information to determine these things. So this report, which you can access at this QR code, is available, and part of it is we drew a very complicated diagram of the supply chain of open access books. Looks a little bit something like this, but it is absolutely inappropriate to go through in a conference. So this is the boiled down version that is a little bit friendlier. So the gist of it is there are a lot of stakeholders involved in open access books. And by that supply chain, I mean everyone involved from the creation and the publication of works to putting them on different platforms to making them accessible through different channels. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then helping the books become discoverable to their end users and then reach the eventual end use. The other thing that we looked at is how information about that use traveled back upstream to the original publishers, authors, and funders of that work. And this is the simple version, of course. This looks like a linear process, but one of the things that we found is that this is actually quite complicated in the world of OA books. If you think about a book as one standalone unit, right? It's something one author creates, they then publish, it is put out into the world. It immediately becomes more complicated than that. It can then go through different distribution channels. It is often put on different platforms, so it can be accessed in different ways by different people. Something that's very specific and unique about book publishing in particular is a lot of university presses have very strong consumer and retail sales as well as library sales. So just as many libraries are buying copies of that book, there may also be individuals accessing copies of that book on their Kindle, for example. So both of those channels still have to be accommodated by OA books. And that's why when you look at this supply chain, you see things like sales channels are mentioned here. A lot of the distributors are going to be shared. That is actually on purpose. That's not me misspeaking for a couple of different reasons. One very important one is that often with books, there is still a very important print distribution component, even when the OA book itself is published OA. There are also cases where books are not initially published OA, and so they may have been for sale for a time, and so those channels that were selling them now have to be notified and make that book more accessible. And also the distribution through different channels is important because the goal is to make sure that the book reaches its intended audience. That may not always be through libraries. So OA Books distribution wants to make sure all of the books reach their intended audiences wherever they are. And that's why you see the OAEBUDT infrastructure borrow very much from the traditional books infrastructure as it stands today. Now, when you look at this upstream usage reporting component, what's very interesting about this is that there are actually a lot of stakeholders in this legacy supply chain that don't know about usage of OAEBUDT, and they also kind of don't care. If you think about a sales channel, if you think about going to your bookstore, you buy a book from them, they never find out, and frankly, I'm glad they don't find out whether I ever crack the spine. It just doesn't matter to them. What matters then is that the book unit has moved. So this brings me to some of the most important findings from this report, and that's a lot of the books infrastructure that's in place for open access books is focused on sales as a metric of success. Now, obviously, that doesn't quite work for open access books because even though it may flow through the same channels, these aren't really sales that we're talking about. An OA book is not successful because it's sold. That's literally kind of the opposite of what the model is. And so you need a different language and a different metric of success for OA books. And usage is a really good candidate for this. It is part of the goal of open access publishing for many of the stakeholders in this supply chain to increase its access to all of its intended audiences. But again, because a lot of how OA books are distributed comes out of that legacy infrastructure, there's a real challenge in making sure that communication about usage gets to all of the right places and is even communicated in a way that makes sense. So what we found in the report, some of the challenges and the opportunities here that we looked at, the challenges came from what I talked about in the description of the supply chain itself. One book can be distributed across lots of different platforms. It can be distributed different models on different platforms. So publishers may sell versions of the book on Kindle. They may make it open access to certain library platforms, perhaps not all of them. There are also cases we know where books are published paid access, then made open access later, so you have to sort all of that out. And my favorite is when a book is paid access, but then there is an open access chapter. And so communicating usage and delivery about that book can be very challenging for lots of those legacy reasons. The opportunities we identified have to do with making sure that information about those books flows through the supply chain appropriately, that the metadata is updated continuously so that if a book's status changes, that is clear to everyone downstream. But most pertinent to this data trust conversation is that publishers need a way to be able to have a view that is consolidated and complete about usage across platforms. Today, publishers have to look at 5 different reports from 5 different platforms, make sure that they all make sense among each other, and communicate that back to authors and funders in a way that makes sense to them. It is a big challenge in helping everyone reconcile why these open access programs exist and are they successful. So I'm going to say a little bit more about a follow-up study that we did because we were also a curious group that looked at other types of outputs, so looked at open journals and open data. We just published this study earlier this year. There are obviously very clear differences between journals and books and data, and I'm the first person to say that, but what we wanted to ask is, where are there similarities perhaps for these same challenges across different outputs, and also how much might books infrastructure be able to extend to solve some of these similar challenges? So there are all similar, very complicated graphs for both open journals and open data. Lucky you get the highlights here. I'm not going to go through all of those either. But just to touch on them, there's an interesting thing happening in journals these days where the multi-platform distribution model is increasingly becoming common for open journal articles specifically. And this is because there are more syndication deals happening between publishers where previously journals were distributed to one primary platform, maybe 2 primary platforms. And so it was pretty clear that the usage would be happening in one place. Now publishers are syndicating their articles. There is the increasing expectation that there will be different versions of articles available. There might be an author-accepted manuscript in some places, a preprint in some places, and then the version of record on perhaps a few different platforms. So they're starting to have the same challenge of understanding usage of journals across different platforms. What's interesting, though, is that for journals, usage has always been a measure of success. It's always been something that's very ingrained in the supply chain. If you think about the purchase decisions that are happening in the legacy journal subscription model, libraries are looking at usage and making cost per use evaluations, and that's informing their future decisions. When you're moving to an open access model and funding open access, usage at an institutional level doesn't really matter as much. It's more about global usage. But how you evaluate that is, again, somewhat challenging. And so that's becoming a little bit more nebulous. And there are conversations about what usage means now increasingly in a journal's context. For data, so we're using the language of supply chain here because that's what we talk about for journals and books. But this is a very different ecosystem where this supply chain is not evolving out of a business process. For open data, it's very much been a given that the goal is to make open data sets as accessible as possible. So that language of success and broad access and broad usability is more of a foundational principle, and that's very clear. The difference here is that the infrastructure and the standards are a lot more nascent. So there are many repositories with very robust metadata schemes. They help to make sure that data is accessible to each of their different niche audiences, but these schemes don't necessarily bridge across fields. The same term can be used in different ways, whether you're a geneticist or a physicist or what have you. And it doesn't make sense to necessarily combine all of these metadata standards into one, even though there is a layer of metadata that can be common across repositories, and there are initiatives like the General Repository Ecosystem Initiative, which are trying to define that and build that connective infrastructure like DataCite to support more of that. But the challenge is that not every repository has yet built that infrastructure to support those things. There are many repositories that don't even have DOIs yet, which is a very sort of foundational persistent identifier that's important to this ecosystem. So, long way to say, as far as that question of could something like a shared usage data trust solve many of these problems, there are certainly shared opportunities here. You can see that in a lot of cases, there is precedent for shared infrastructure. Counter is a standard for usage that actually spans each of these different types of research outputs. There are many other standards which are content agnostic. And there's also, you can hear sort of a shared desire to understand better and connect better what usage is happening where when you're talking about open outputs. The main finding, though, is that there are enough differences where thinking about the infrastructure that's needed, it does need to be fit for purpose. Each of the challenges we looked at for journals, books, and data are somewhat unique. And so from that perspective, it makes sense to focus something like the ebooks usage, or something like a data trust on a specific use case. And for OAEBUDT, there's a very strong use case with the multi-platform distribution that just comes out of its legacy model. So this seems like a very smart place to start as a case study and proof of concept, even though we can see that there is potential for extension in future. So I probably went over my time. So I'm going to turn it back to Christina from the OAEBUDT Usage Data Trust to say more. Thank you.
So how many people knew usage was complicated when they came in? Okay. This is the interactive part. Excellent. Well, follow-up question. How many people have heard of a data space prior to coming in here? Okay, great. We have two. So my hope is by the time you leave today, you have more understanding kind of both of those to know that there are people out there trying to make this all a bit easier. I'll see if I can make up some time for Michelle, but we have a bunch here because my goal is to tell you about what we're doing and what this data space concept is. It's important to always remember the why we're in this. And as you just heard from Laura, usage is complex. How that data travels is complex, but libraries need to have access to that trusted data for not only operations and reporting, but budgetary decision making. That means that the data has to be trusted, high quality, timely, to really impact those decisions. And that context really matters. Things like benchmarking or point in time really helps with that decision making. The trick is that the types of usage data, as you think about who has access to this and the difference between Counter and, say, Google Analytics, it can widely vary. And over decades as a sector, we here as librarians really always keep privacy at the core. We know we want to protect who reads and what they read. However, that's always balanced against openness. And standards such as Counter really have given us a way historically to manage that balancing. The question really becomes, though, as we have newer technologies that allow organizations to exchange sensitive data or confidential data among competitors, does that open up opportunities for us? Can we take some of the technologies coming out of healthcare and finance to see if we can get more granular in the data we can use without compromising privacy? And I think that's the key here. So our work has really centered around this question of whether we can leverage those technologies, especially as we see them coming out of other organizations that have put substantial funding into building them out, and apply them here in scholarly communications. One of the things that we're looking at is how we can take a neutral intermediary, Europe is calling them data intermediaries, and really have that as a protocol layer utility that all of us can benefit from to unlock temporary use and exchange through direct data connections. So that's different than what we often do today, where you harvest the data, make a copy, and then monetize it. Instead, we're talking about controlled data connectors directly between those parties, the data owners and creators who are managing that usage data, and the analytics providers, the report creators, and the institutions that want to have access to it. The potential benefits of moving to this approach of kind of controlled direct connections range from increasing efficiency and security, but also getting to that higher quality, more timely data at scale, while also reducing risks that are associated with data proliferation outside of your control, as well as streamlining that contract review and authorization process. This is kind of what got us towards thinking about where that neutral kind of data brokerage in the middle fits and how that might address some of these issues when we know this usage data supply chain involves a number of competing publishers, presses, and platforms that have to share data with each other to get that holistic view. Lucky for us, the challenge of how to get competitors to collaboratively share their data is not a unique problem to scholarly communications, and it is indeed industry-wide, and a core part of Europe's data strategy. Through Horizon Europe, there's actually been billions of dollars that have gone into developing technological infrastructure roadmaps, reference architectures, and governance models to address these challenges. We are looking at how do we adapt this for scholarly communications using, as Laura had mentioned, OAEBUDT usage and those countermetrics as a place to start. In fact, this data space architecture, you can look, there's an International Data Spaces Association. It's already in use in a number of sectors, such as automotive logistics and news media. And they're in the process of taking the German standard through ISO, IEEE, and W3C right now. We kind of discovered this early on while we were doing our background research. And I have to say a very special thank you to the Mellon Foundation and the National Science Foundation, without whom we wouldn't be here today. They've not only supported kind of that foundational research, including the reports you just saw Laura discuss, but also support our governance formation, because we know we want to be kind of abiding by the principles of open scholarly infrastructure and truly neutral and trusted within our community. Some of you may have seen my prior presentations. We had a workshop here in this room in Charleston last year to engage the community in developing this. And now, as planned, you can see we've kind of learned from all this foundational research to now actually move into that technical build of the data space infrastructure that's been worked out through Europe and is now in their 4th version. For those who don't know, we do have our established principles, vision, mission, trustees. If you go to our website, oaebookusage.org, that is all on there. And over the past few years, our governance has actually formalized a process by which we are moving to be fiscally hosted by OPRES EU, which is an infrastructure consortia in Europe. And this hasn't just been by our advisors. We have our project advisory boards, our trustees, we have individuals who serve on our committees, and numerous others who have contributed to this work across 5 continents, not to mention the countless individuals who have participated in our consultations virtually, online focus groups, and in-person workshops. The technical infrastructure that we're looking at now is the next phase is to build out the minimum viable data space using the fourth version of the reference architecture that exists. This is all open source. It is all out there, so you can go look at it, see me if you need more references. We're very lucky to have some innovative leaders in our industry who are willing to be among the first to work with a data space expert, think IT, to build out this data space model for scholarly communications with that specific focus on the exchange of counter-compliant book and chapter level metrics as a place to start. And again, these are those direct data connectors, as well as some of the standard agreements that have been developed over 13 months to ensure that there is trust in this community. That said, with OA Books being such a small slice of scholarly outputs, our advisors and trustees voted to formally explore how such a data space infrastructure could extend and support scholarly communications more broadly, and especially support the exchange of other types of sensitive data connections. So over the next 2 years, we're going to be looking to develop grant-funded work to explore how this data space can support use cases such as the provision of data for knowledge graphs or the evaluation of open access funding models by the members of those funding model networks. These are research teams that are forming right now. So if any of you are interested in this, please reach out. My cards and a document about that are up here right by the door. I should note that while we're actively developing not only governance and the technology, we've definitely been looking at sustainability because we know we want to abide by the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. Over the past year, we also had workshops that invited our stakeholders to answer these questions of what would be a trusted way to recover the costs to provide such a shared infrastructure. As you might expect, membership fees and grants came out on top of cost recovery-based fees. But I will note that, it's a precarious time to base everything on membership. So with that, we're trying right now to explore what that means while we're looking at those research and development grants. And this past quarter, our board authorized a pilot of a supporting membership. So if this is something that your organization would be interested in, you can now directly contribute to the development of this effort. And the QR code there takes you to a page to learn more. So the last thing I want to share with you is a bit about what makes this data space model unique. In the data space model, the data providers accept full responsibility for accurately describing the usage data that they provide and make available to others. In some ways, it acts as a marketplace and a clearinghouse where you can make transparent information that describes that usage data, including things like licensing. Our rulebook that we developed with all of our stakeholders at the table is informing those standard contractual clauses and participation agreements that require not only disclosures about the data, but the transparency in participation as well. And while we have an ecosystem developing here with a trust network, it requires membership to join, it requires honesty in how you describe things. It also has accountability measures built in to make sure that all of the players are playing by the rules and that there is an issue reporting and resolution process if they don't. So if anyone has any questions about this, I can definitely talk afterwards, but I think the report here that is linked, this is actually our rulebook. It is now 70 pages. We handed it over to the lawyers who turned it into the, as you might expect, standard contractual clauses, so the model language that would go into the legal agreements between parties. OPRIS, as that host of the technical build, is going to be executing these with our pilot partners and road testing it for our pilot. But this is giving us an opportunity to make sure that we can not only have trust when people enter, but maintain that trust over time when it involves the exchange of sensitive data, the access and use of sensitive data. So that was a lot. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Michelle, who is representing LibLynx, which is one of our pilot partners.
Welcome. Thank you for coming out today. I know there's a lot of other cool places to be, so appreciate that you're here. I do work for LibLynx. I am the client success manager there. If you're familiar with LibLynx, you may know us through your counter statistics that you log in. We provide that service for a number of publishers, many of whom are here today. We also do identity and access services. So you may encounter our where are you from page. Sometimes that is a good thing, and sometimes that is not a good thing, depending on the circumstance. However, here today we're talking about something a little bit tangential to both of those topics, but it does pertain to countery-like things because we're going to talk about metadata. Oh, good. Okay, I'm going to just set my computer down. Wasn't sure if the font would be large enough. Okay, so I am first and foremost metadata pragmatist. Metadata is dirty. It needs a lot of help. It's never clean. There's always more work to do. And so the next 3 slides are about what we can do to actually make data flow. So just a huge, starting back at the beginning, history of usage data. We all know Counter, right? We're heading into Counter 5.1 in January of next year. Counter is 25 years old, which is kind of wild to think about. Google Analytics, much younger, relatively speaking, is only 15 years old. Counter it's an older model, but it's one that is enormously useful. It's the equivalent of the checkout, the electronic checkout usage tracking for librarians. It does not track user behavior. So taking note where like a user is from, of course, beyond institutional affiliation, the communities they participate in, the amount of time they spend with a given piece of content, none of these things are of interest to Counter for the privacy reasons that were already mentioned. Conversely, Google Analytics, of course, tracks this deeply. They're very invested in this. This is how they keep you on Google. It's a website, of course. But I'm going to argue that with open access book usage, we need to find a middle ground in between the electronic checkout model and the deeply invasive Google Analytics track everything model. The information that we need about users to make and their behaviors to make useful analytics for libraries to use to make good open access purchasing decisions and commitment decisions will come from a combination of these 2 things. All right, let's see. Go to the next one. Click. There we go. Practicalities. So what do we need to do this? We need standardized inputs and outputs. We need to follow FAIR principles. The pathway for extending current practices needs to follow something that everybody can use. It needs to be relatively simple. The barrier to entry needs to be fairly low. Counter, although it is wonderful, the barrier to entry for publishers, you ask a publisher, do they love providing Counter? Chances are the answer is going to be no. It's hard. There's a reason why LibLynx as a company exists in the world, and of course our largest competitor, Scholarly IQ. The other thing that's really important about providing good usage stats is that they are useful for all of the stakeholders. So Counter, again, is wonderful. It does a lot of things, but it is primarily directed at libraries and certain pieces of the library. It is not directed at your deans. It is not directed at the researchers that feed that data. It is not directed at the publishers who are making business decisions about what to publish and what to carry in their portfolios. But Counter reports are interoperable. If you look at one Counter report, it should have the exact same columns for publisher A as it does for publisher B as publisher C. The advantage of having an interoperable format like that is if they're deposited, you know what you're putting in and you know what you're getting out on the other side. So I think Counter is by far our best model to date. And the next one. So how do we make this data flow? I don't have any specific answers today, but we need clear metadata about content. We need clear metadata about users, and we need to sync up the users with that content. In terms of actually moving a data package around, I think the archivists in the room probably can offer us a good model. We're not going to go into all the details of this particular diagram, but the SIP, the AIP, and the DIP models from this is actually shared, I believe, the American Society for American Archivists website. Let me just make sure that I get what those are called. The SIP is a submission information package, so what you put into the IDS, potentially. The AIP is the archival information package, so that's going to be actually what's in the content that will be then pulled out. And then on the other side of that is the dissemination package. So there could be really specific rules about what to do to submit it, to keep it, and then to pull it out. And these are already in place. We don't have to invent that. There's already industry standards set up for that. So finally, the other thing that we need to have is a trust marker. And I think creating a model like this, in addition to having those really clear rules about what the content metadata is and what the user metadata is, will allow for people, one, to buy into this as being a good thing to have, and then two, that it can be trustworthy data. So you as a librarian, you as a funder, you as a provost are coming in to look at this data, it can mean something, and it'll mean the same thing to Provost A as it will to Provost B because the data is interoperable. And with that, I am going to cede the floor because we have 8 minutes.